Thanks, and thanks so much for the opportunity to come and talk today. It's been very enjoyable hearing the discussions and the very excellent presentations. Been very impressed with what I've been hearing. So a little bit about myself. I am a principal analyst with Forrester. I have previously held positions with Accenture, twice actually. And previously also with Target, Best Buy, Wells Fargo. I think some of you are starting to infer maybe where he's from. He must be from Minneapolis, because that's where Target and Best Buy are, of course. Ultimately, 6 years as the chief architect for the business of IT with Wells Fargo, and ultimately VP, had an all-access pass to many interesting operational questions, building out the architecture necessary to support what at that time, and I think still is, a $5 billion a year IT pipeline. So definitely been thinking a lot about how we run large-scale IT operations, and I'm here to offer you some perspectives on this problem of coordination, especially as we get into critical incidents and related topics. So I'll talk today. I've been asked to start it off with an attempt to define DevOps, put DevOps in a nutshell, put a little a scope around it, because yeah, there still is this thing. What do we mean by this? And then I'm going to segue from there into some discussion of coordination, but from a bit more of a rigorous sense. Now also, fair warning, I am adjunct faculty at the University of St. Thomas. I will try not to drag us down an academic rabbit hole, but I think that there are some benefits to talking more precisely about things like coordination, especially in high-tempo, high-consequence situations. And that will lead to some discussion about also some proposed dimensions for thinking about the coordination problem, and also at different scales. And then we'll do a little bit, I have a matrix that will be made available to you as part of the presentation, and we'll work through some of the matrix a little bit, and maybe we'll try to get some interactivity going. But at that point, it's going to be getting pretty close to the bar time, which I think is actually at 3. So I'm conscious of being both on the wrong side of the lunch sleepy zone, and then also in between you and the drinks. So yeah, I'll just do my best here. Feel free to, throw things at me if you're done and, ready to adjourn. So, speed. Yeah, what is that about? And how do we understand especially failure in the context of speed? So we hear a lot about, fail fast, celebrate failure, so on and so forth. I want to put a little bit of a different spin on it. Let's say you're riding your bike. And when you ride your bike, are you always at a perfect mathematical 180-degree angle? No. If you deviate from 180 degrees to 178 degrees, is that failure? Well, probably not, because you're still going to get to where you're going in terms of outcome. So no, it's not failure. But you also want to then course correct. And when we talk about celebrating failure and failing fast, I encourage you all to think more in terms of that journey on your bike, where failure actually is falling over or getting hit by a car, and that's not the kind of failure we want to celebrate. But to actually realize that you have gone to 178 or 170 degrees off center, and you've restored yourself to 180 degrees, that's the kind of fast failure, fast feedback that we've been talking about as an industry when we say fail fast. So it's a very different, I think, paradigm, maybe a little bit more comforting for those of you who are a bit more old school. What is this with fail fast? I mean, we don't want to fail. Failure is not an option. Well, I don't want to fail in terms of getting hit by a car either. So I'm just trying to, bring this discussion, this debate together. So from that need for speed and fast course correction, we as an industry have developed DevOps. And shameless name dropping, I was one of Gene Kim's first reviewers on the Phoenix project. I have been fascinated by the topic of DevOps for a long time, This is how I summarize it, and this is based on Puppet's State of DevOps research. So it is neither the Wikipedia definition nor is it the columns definition, but if you read the Puppet State of DevOps research, these are the three major areas that they focus on: continuous delivery, lean product development, effective culture and organization, and all of these together lead to an increased ability to release and deliver digital value at that increased tempo. But what does it really mean to deliver at that increased tempo? One of the most insightful comments I've seen recently in the discussion of DevOps has been from Damon Edwards. He talks about the iron triangle. And we all know the iron triangle, right? Scope, quality, time, pick any two, so on and so forth. The thesis in DevOps is that actually if you optimize for speed, you can achieve better quality and better schedule. The iron triangle is actually not made of iron anymore. So what does that mean then also in terms of system stability? We saw when they first proposed DevOps, it was in 2009, I think, was the seminal presentation, 10 deploys a day, not 2, 10 deploys a day at Flickr, John Allspaw. Fascinating presentation, and everybody said, how on earth are their systems staying stable? They must be having horrible quality problems. But because they had realized that there was a feedback loop and that the ideal was to run that feedback loop more quickly, that ultimately that would result in faster delivery with improved stability. Because when you make a small change to a complex system, it is much better than making a large change. You're going to have much greater likelihood of a positive outcome. But that goes against what we've been taught. So the next 3 slides are the outcome of discussions that I had with a fellow named Jez Humble, who wrote Continuous Delivery. I was updating my edition of my book. He had just come out with Continuous Delivery. And so I got Jez on the phone, and I said, Jez, I'm trying to make sense of DevOps. And here's how I'm going to tell the story. I'm going to say that change and stability are opposed. And he said, wait. No, that's not right. And because I hadn't thought through all of the analogies, the cycling analogy, I was still bought into the old school thinking that many of us, how many of you still would have been brought up? Change and stability, choose one or the other, diametrical opposites. That's how we've been brought up to think. And yet, just like the iron triangle starting to break down, change versus stability, this mental model we have, is now breaking down. And let me show you how. I don't know how well you can see this. It's actually not so bad. But I apologize for the small type here. I'm going to show you 2 reinforcing feedback loops. One of them is something that is ultimately a destructive loop, a vicious cycle, and the next one is a virtuous cycle. Here's the vicious cycle. You have a slow change management process. Checklists, CAB meetings, and we can even think of the change process more globally as the change process of developing a new idea and trying to bring that to fruition. That is a form of the change process, although many of us who use ITIL think of it more strictly in terms of the 2-week lead time. But let's just think about change more globally. So it's slow because we've got a lot of governance, we've got a lot of process in place, and the result of that change process is we tend to accumulate a large backlog of work in process. And actually, from a lean and manufacturing point of view, this is invisible work in process, which is particularly evil. And the concept of invisible work in process, I always give Don Reinertson a shout out as one of the leading thinkers in this space. So when you have a big backlog, what's the temptation? Clear the backlog. Let's do a big batch of change. We've got a terribly complex system or a system of systems, but we're tired of having this big backlog, so let's just shove in this big batch. How many of you have been on those releases? And how many of you have loved that experience? This is where the 72-hour working weekends come in, right? And then half of it fails, and so you have decreased change success. And then what's the executive response? If only we had managed risk better. If only we had been even more rigorous, more checklists, more governance, more process. Oh, and all the changes that failed here, I also stayed in the backlog. So what's the ultimate outcome? An even larger backlog. And you just spiral down and spiral down and spiral down. Here's what they discovered with DevOps, and this is why DevOps is taking some time to percolate through the industry, because we're actually talking about two dynamic feedback loops. Here is the more virtuous cycle. You want to speed up the change process, and the first thing you do is you start reducing the size of those changes. Now, this has strong and credible roots in lean thinking, reduced batch sizes. Right? When we reduce the batch size, we can reduce the work in process. This is also a well-known outcome from Lean, and just because Lean started in manufacturing does not mean that it's not applicable in this particular case. The evidence is quite clear that Lean is applicable here. I'm not one to mindlessly say, well, manufacturing, we can just kind of swallow it all and turn IT into a manufacturing plant. Not saying that. But in this case, it's relevant. And then when you reduce the work in process and you start making smaller, more incremental changes, you start having an increased change success rate, which leads to being able to do change more frequently. And one of my definitions of capability improvement is how many times have you run that particular cycle? If you're trying to improve your capability to execute a process, one of the indicators, the objective measurable indicators of process capability is how many times have you cycled the process. A company that has seen 500,000 employees go through its hire to retire life cycle probably has a deeper HR management capability than a company that's only had a few dozen, everything else being equal. A company that has executed hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of changes has a deeper change capability than a company that just does it once or twice a year, given within the bounds of a certain product. And in fact, this was what somebody asked me 2-3 years ago. Charlie, DevOps, blah, blah, blah. Don't go down the rabbit hole. Give me 15 seconds. I bet you can't give me 15 seconds that I can say to my leader, my CEO in an elevator. And I thought and I said, change more often so you get good at it. And he said, thank you. And he went and he used it. And this company now is notable and is keynoting the DevOps Enterprise Summit. I won't say who. This results, and then here's the big asterisk. You don't get to this positive feedback just by beating people up and saying, work faster. That's wrong. You have to invest additionally in improving your change and release capability. You need test-driven automation. You need continuous integration. You need all of that goodness. You need to invest in culture. You need to invest in understanding culture, even measuring culture, and culture is measurable. That is one of the key pillars of the State of DevOps research. It's one of Nicole Forsgren's research agenda points as she continues to be provide great intellectual leadership on that important work. And when you have this increased change tempo and you make your investments in improving your change capability, then you actually have this accelerated change process and this ability to more dynamically adapt to the challenges of digital transformation. So that is DevOps, my current DevOps in a nutshell presentation. But from this presentation, I'm now going to take rather much of a left turn, because let's look at the specifics of why many of us are here today, is that even in this nirvana, stuff gonna happen. And yeah, we see it. I mean, chaotic, complex systems result in occasionally chaotic outcomes, where you are in a situation of having to sense and act and respond and just try to get things back on track because people are losing brain cells. Great. I'm going to steal that. I'm going to be all over that loss of brain cells thing. That was an awesome quote. And we still have some basic facts in the industry, like mean time to recover. Now, I am all in favor of questioning best practices and received wisdom, and I'll beat up on the capability maturity model and half a dozen other things that we've received and said, we need to be critical about all of it. But MTTR, I can still ride with MTTR. I don't have a problem with looking at the average mean time to resolve of incidents, and we can learn some things from that. And some of the research Forrester's done over the years, I think this is from our stuff, is that the majority of MTTR you need to identify so that you're having an issue. You need to know what the nature is of the issue and who might best be suited for working on it. You then need to actually fix it, but that's less time than the mean time to know. And then the mean time to verify that the fix is actually taking place. And this is outside. This is just immediate, what classical ITIL would call incident response. This is not getting into problem management, which I really won't touch on today. I won't talk about problem management, much as I might like to talk about things like blamelessness. So as we look at this, we see the majority is this mean time to know. And other research, this is actually McKinsey, consistent with this other research. Knowledge workers spend 20% of their time looking for internal information, at least 20%. I think it's actually higher than that. I think it's pretty conservative. I think that Peter Drucker, I think, pointed this out 20 years ago, that so much of what the modern professional does is a quest for information. But let's leave it at that. And when we are in this situation, this structured situation, saying we need to muster some knowledge, we need to muster information together so that we can make some decisions, well, one of the things we do is we create an artifact. And the artifact that we know best is, of course, the venerable ticket. I actually have an older one I use sometimes. The Pieceworks Stove Ticket is this old gray thing from Etsy, But what does it mean to have a ticket? A ticket is a coordination artifact. It is a signal. It is a statement of shared intent that some situation has emerged that needs a coordinated response. All right, I've used a word there about 5 times in that past sentence. What word was that? What do we mean by that? Anyways, we've talked about coordination, but what do we mean, especially in the context we're in of complex adaptive systems that are diverse and interconnected and behave differently today than they did yesterday? It's not trivial actually achieving outcomes, desired and somewhat consistent outcomes, in the middle of this continuously evolving, complex situation we find ourselves in. It all starts with people. But we also have a number of other resources that need to be mustered, and we have a lot of simplistic answers. We have a lot of partial knowledge. We have an incident process. Great. Is that coordination by definition? Well, we don't need process. We need cross-functional 2-pizza teams. And they're just going to collaborate, and they'll figure it out. Right? That's kind of the other extreme. We need to empower the collaborative teams to self-organize. We're going to have loosely coupled systems with APIs. And I can continue to spin the buzzwords here. I get paid for that. Right? We're going to use the big room. We're going to get everybody in a big room. Right? So that we don't have to have artifacts. Because then in a big room, you don't have the electronic ticketing system. You don't have ServiceNow because you have an information radiator, you have a Kanban board, and you stick a red-colored Post-it note up on the board. But then the trouble is well, we got maybe 80 people here. It doesn't scale to 500. You send out the email blast, and then you get the reply all storm, right? Or you wind up with the incident call with 500 people on it, just because, right? Where have we heard about that today? Right? Ticket says the primary collaborative vehicle, yes or no. We have too much work in process in the queues. One size fits all support models. There's a lot of problems we have in this coordination space. And it all comes back to the fact that we are trying to coordinate in fast changing environments The systems that we're coordinating across are persistent. They're not static, though. What works today doesn't work tomorrow. And so you've got to have an adaptive problem-solving capability. Now, this is nothing new. Where have we done this before? So I'm going to quote from, this is a quote from John Allspaw. I mentioned him previously, the 10 deploys a day at Flickr person, former chief technical officer of Etsy, and one of the, I think, leading lights in this field. He recently completed a master's thesis, and he chose as his topic applying safety science to incident response in digital organizations. And he worked with the top thinkers in the world on this, people like Sidney Dekker. Now I'm going to read, and this is the only quote I'm going to read of this nature. I'm going to read directly from John's thesis because I think this is so on target. From a safety science perspective, he says, there is a dearth of research in the current literature that attempts to investigate the issue of team-based anomaly response in the domain of web and internet engineering. Anomaly response, incident management, work with me here. However, he goes on, there is not a lack of human factors and system safety research on the topics of teams engaging in understanding and resolving anomalies under high tempo and high consequence conditions, i.e., people losing brain cells. This research has been performed in other domains, healthcare, aviation, space operations, military, etc., and patterns have emerged that would be prudent to explore. That's kind of a mouthful there. Let me break it down for you. What he's saying is, let's not be stupid and reinvent the wheel. People, cops, aviation professionals have forgotten more about incident management than we've ever learned in 30 years of ITIL. With apologies to the ITIL professionals in the room. This is where it gets real. I mean, people, they study this stuff. They take on work like forensics on airplane crashes where hundreds of people lost their lives. And they look at this stuff, and not just one person, but teams of people look at this stuff and write reports and try to figure out what went wrong. And this is where the postmortems do come in, and I guess I'll riff a little bit on blameless postmortems because they have developed a very clinical and objective approach. And they look at the failure as a failure of the system, not as a failure of the individual. They discovered a long time ago, well, how many of you are parents? So if there's some situation emerges at home, and one of the learnings that they've learned is that when there's a situation you're trying to figure out what happens, when you're interviewing somebody and that person thinks that there are going to be consequences based on the interview, the answers you get are less reliable. Is this surprising to any of the parents in the room? And yet we have this concept of accountability, which in misused contexts is nothing more than shaming, blaming, naming, shaming, and blaming. They had to get past that decades ago in aviation because otherwise they realized we are not going to have a safe civil aviation infrastructure in the world. And that would actually probably be a bad thing. So that's why we have such rigorous practices in the safety sciences. And now that digital is becoming the way that the world works, WannaCry. I mean, patients were checking into emergency rooms in the UK, and the doctors did not know what medications they were on. A patient presents in distress, and you don't know what drugs they're on, and they can't answer the question because of that virus. So we're moving into some very serious domains as we consider what it means to be able to effectively respond to incidents in this new world. Okay, the next 3 slides are the hardest, right? Because I'm going to drag you through the framework, the definition, the best academic definition I've seen on coordination. I'm drawing this from, Allspaw was the one who pointed this out. He based a lot of his work on this person, Klein. This is my paraphrase of Klein. This is what we mean by coordination. Choreographed joint activity depending on interpredictability, drawing on common ground, founded in a basic compact. Let me unpack that. It's a real mouthful. But, it's not partial differential equations. It's understandable English words that are being used in a particular way. So, the paper is to be found in that book, which, given the title, is not the first book I would consider, for an exploration of things like incident management. But it's a very interesting book, and I find it's challenging but readable. First and foremost, you have to have shared intent. Good patient outcomes, selling more things on my e-commerce store, providing Social Security checks on a timely basis. These are all good outcomes. You have a shared intent for the good. This is your basic compact. This is that you're together doing something. You're sharing some intent, and there is interdependence. There is absolutely a reality that in order to deliver good patient outcomes or the Social Security check, some group of people is or are interdependent. Upon that, you need these things. You need people to be directable. If they won't respond to stimuli, suggestion, input, they're not directable, you can't coordinate. If they're just going to go off and do whatever they're going to do, that's not coordination. Anybody have any team members like that? You also have to have some common ground of understanding. Now, they've moved away, some of the safety sciences, they've moved away from the term mental model or shared mental model. For reasons that I find a little academic. Speaking as an academic, I'm not sure why they decided that shared mental model was not a favorable term. But they've gone to something that they call interpredictability, which is just or common ground, which is just kind of your basic assumptions, your basic operating assumptions. We know what has recently happened in the past. We know what the process is supposed to be. We know who the members of the team are. That's their common ground. And then there's an assumption, and this is where coordination starts to become a bit more of an art than a science, is interpredictability. My level of confidence that if I tell somebody over there that I've got a Sev1, they're going to behave a certain way. If I tell somebody over there, I think it might be a database problem, we need to look at the logging on Oracle, that DBA is then going to engage in a certain set of activities that make sense given the context. That is interpredictability. Now, the thing is that in this kind of research, if you dig further in and look at the sciences, part of the research program is trying to quantify some of these things. So this is not just ideas that people throw at a wall and say, oh, this might be a good thing. When people of this, when folks of this type are proposing this stuff, they're actually starting to drive research agendas from it, where they can actually start to quantify it. Finally, this is the area where we understand best. To call choreography, well, choreography engines, they're a thing. A lot of us understand choreography, process management, state management. You have phases. Well, we understand that an incident initiation usually comes before incident closure. There's a basic sequencing there. There's phases. There's channels. Now, channels is where tools like xMatters get really interesting because it's a channel management platform that helps you manage all the different channels that and in many ways the signals as well. But all of this depends on your criteria for joint activity and meeting these requirements of interpredictability. What good does it do for me to send somebody a text, go check out the logging in the Oracle database if I don't have the interpredictability confidence that they're going to do the right thing and they're going to go over and look at the SQL Server farm or something, So you have to have these basic concepts. So this is the current state-of-the-art concepts, safety science concepts that are used if you are looking at investigating, for example, why a particular major incident had the outcome that it did. If you're trying to do your forensic analysis, your causal analysis, it's the other thing. Root cause has also been, dismissed by some of the safety science people because crises happen because of multiple factors, blah, blah, blah. The word root cause still comes out of my mouth sometimes. These are some of the things that you can look at as a very objective clinical frame on why a certain situation progressed the way it did. This is some of the language and terminology that they will apply when trying to figure out, hey, the forest fire, 30 people died in Portugal. You better believe there's going to be some forensics on that one. So hopefully this is somewhat helpful. There's even more I could go into. I guess the final point, the paper is really rich. I've only touched on some of the definitional aspects. It goes much further. But I was certainly interested to see they do make a call that the fundamental breakdown of common ground, the root cause, their root cause, and they don't use the word root cause, of course, but they argue that this is the fundamental breakdown, is when people are confused over who knows what. And that is a matter of feedback. And somebody talked earlier about the one-way message that then is just assumed. Without confirmation of messages, meaningful response based on, basically they call for a three-phase meaningful response to messages. Attending, so yeah, you're on the call, but you've turned off your phone to, again, talk to earlier example. You're not even attending. You have to attend, and then attend doesn't mean physically present, it means mentally present. Then you need to perceive. You hear the words, but do you really understand them? And the feedback loop should be able to operate at all three of those levels. Have you confirmed attendance? Well, yeah, you took attendance and somebody said, yeah, here. But are you confirmed that they're attending? Are you confirmed that they are engaged and listening? That's a higher level of feedback, a little harder to achieve. And then finally, the most difficult and yet valuable feedback signal is the feedback on whether they actually understand. And of course, in the military, they do things like, the train, you show me, then have me do it and talk through it, then have me do it. I mean, basic kind of rules of thumb for training that actually then result in theory, better understanding outcomes. Now, I don't know how that translates in an incident management setting, but nevertheless. All right. So that's the coordination problem. And that's some of the definitions, and it was a bit of a whirlwind tour, I think, through some of the language that we're seeing coming out of the safety sciences and then being brought into the industry. Again, kudos to AllSpa for really starting to open people's eyes on this. It's a different set of language than we have been taught, I would suspect. Whether it's universally applicable, I don't know. It certainly doesn't discount the need for things like incident processes, but I do think it gives you a broader frame. So let's bring it on to, this is now my attempt at contributing to the discussion. So this work is original to me, but I will also give credit to a woman named Diane Strode, wrote an excellent paper on coordination mechanisms in co-located agile teams. If anybody wants to cite, it's, again, very readable. I look for academic research that is readable and useful. And actually, it's a pretty small subset of them. But there is some there. There's some there. So one of my goals is to curate and present some of the more useful stuff to folks like you, so you don't have to read all the journals and skim through the abstracts. So she talks about coordination, and again, she takes a very clinical and objective frame. She doesn't get into, oh, Scrum of Scrums is a thing, or oh, let's have a Kanban board. Looking at it more neutrally, you have multiple dimensions across which the coordination problem is solved: space, time, and bandwidth. Space, well, if somebody's here and somebody is in Singapore, that is a different dynamic than if both people are here, correct? If somebody is in one part of the organization and somebody is in a holding company, 8 levels up via an EVP and then 9 levels back down, that is also a form of distance. Also very different than when you're both on the same team. Time. You have certain activities that take place immediately, like my engaging with you in real time in a co-located sense. If we had live video going out, it would be a distributed spatially, but still co-located or synchronous in time. If we record the video and distribute it, then it is both spatially removed and asynchronous. Coordination in high tempo is affected by this. You wind up with questions of latency. And the slower the feedback, so feedback, fast feedback, the word fast, speed, time, whenever you have slower feedback, you have less stability. You have less ability to quickly deliver digital value or respond to situations. So you have to look at the time frame. But the trouble is also that mechanisms like a ticket that are good at handling asynchronous operations, I mean, you put the ticket in ServiceNow or Remedy, and there it stays. It's a good asynchronous artifact, but it's not a great way to drive immediate response. I think that's one of the value propositions for tools like xMatters. The other thing about the ticket is it's auditable. You have asynchronous mechanisms that give you an audit trail. And so that's also important. So you have to look at not only what is the interaction in time, but also then what is the digital exhaust of that tool or capability you're using. And then finally, bandwidth. Now, this is not my best slide, but what I'm trying to represent here is texting, immediate interaction, voice interaction, which has its downsides, as we discussed, but does promote some sense of emotional nuance. And so voice conversations do have their place. They are a bit broader of a feedback channel than, for example, purely text-based mechanisms. I mean, engineers may prefer texting, but the trouble is that texting, a chat channel, is very low bandwidth. And that doesn't mean that chat is not helpful. If you have strong common ground, if you have strong interpredictability, if you've got a great shared sense of what's going on, you know, a 5-word text may be all you need. You don't need to be face-to-face, co-located, interacting synchronously. But in more difficult, challenging, ambiguous situations, the military, for example, has long known that the face-to-face conversation is the most effective way for human beings to transmit information. Ultimately, it comes down to this question of bandwidth. It also, finally, bandwidth also, to me, represents the time a person has available. A person who can engage face-to-face, but only for a few minutes, I think is also low bandwidth, and that's your classic seagull manager. Who knows the term seagull manager? Flies in, makes a lot of noise, makes a big mess, and then flies out. In my mind, that's also a low bandwidth interaction, although I certainly got the full seagull experience when they were there, right? So this brings in also the concept of interruptibility, on call and on duty, and also issues with multitasking. So one of the things we're seeing is some interest in swarming models, which I'll talk further about in a little bit, as potentially higher bandwidth mechanisms. So that's the 3 dimensions of coordination. Now I'm going to try to bring it all together, and I'm going to bring in a third set of concepts, and you probably really are going to want your drinks after this. I've never tried to bring all 3 of these things together, so I'm very interested in feedback, positive or negative, afterwards. But one of the things I've been working with a lot as somebody thinking about the business of IT is the idea of a scaling model. We understand the stack very well. You know, business, application, technology, network, physical plant, or the OSI stack, or architecture stacks, whatever. We also understand the life cycle, plan, build, run. Now, the trouble is there's difficulties in both of those, and I've been experimenting more and more with a scaling model, which is the thought experiment of, okay, you have 2 people in a garage delivering a digital system. Okay, they had enough success that they now have 8 people in the garage delivering a digital system. They all still can get fed by 2 pizzas. Or if you live in Minneapolis or Chicago where it gets cold, you want 3 pizzas because you need the extra carbs in the wintertime, right? Then you get to the big ugly, which is the team of teams. And that's where the coordination problems really start to emerge, and that's where the Agile and DevOps conversation starts to really run into some conflicts at the enterprise level. And I will say, with all due respect to the Agile and DevOps communities, that this is still an unsolved problem from my perspective. It's one I am actively researching, very interested in perspectives on. And then you wind up at the enterprise level, where you're dealing with very long time frames, concerns like governance and control, legitimate concerns. I mean, the term governance, some people view it as a dirty word. As long as we have companies we're building with other people's money, we're going to have governance. Not going to go away. So how do we reconcile the fast, high-performing team level with the enterprise level, and how does this play out, especially in the context of incident response and what we just discussed? So if you're an individual, or if you're founding a company, or you can also extend the thought experiment to just being an individual working in a broader context. But let's start with the company idea. Mostly things are immediate. You're not time shifting. Time shifting is informal. Your monitoring, your troubleshooting is informal. You've got three Amazon EC2 instances, and you log in and you look at them. You log into your website, you look at your website. Do you have Dynatrace? No. Do you have xMatters? Sorry, probably not. Not selling to too many two-person shops in the garage, right? But it's a useful thought experiment because that person they are concerned with infrastructure and they are concerned with an application pipeline. I would say that even two people in a garage should be doing a continuous delivery pipeline, certainly putting your stuff in Git or GitHub. And so you wind up with some basic telemetry, and you wind up with basic informal incident response. And I think also from an individual perspective, this is where, as a consumer of digital services, I bring in the concept of left shifting, which kind of anticipates what we're going to talk to at higher levels of scale. But ultimately, left shifting is the ideal of pushing things back down to that individual level. Not even having to solve the collaboration or coordination problems because you've short-circuited them. You've managed to get it all back down to where repetitive and reoccurring issues are solved close to origin. They're solved by the individual consuming the service. You scale up. You're now a team. You start to formalize your concept of product, your concept of work management. You have Kanban boards. You're formalizing how it is you understand user stories and customer journeys. And you also start to formalize the concept of operations. You start to see that some of the work your company does is less variable, more repeatable, and yet more interrupt-driven. And you also discover that some of your staff really groove on that kind of work. And so you start to say, ops, yeah, it's a thing. There's a need for it, and some of my people are better at it. I'm not a fan of saying everybody can do everything all the time. I mean, I know people who love ops, and they do ops, and other people, it's like, heads down, don't bother me, I'm figuring out the algorithm, right? And our people are different, So you need to account for this more interrupt-driven world. You need to monitor, you need to track, you need to respond. It's still possible to have an all-hands-on-deck process, and you still might just have a Kanban board, although you're probably starting to need to formalize that work management. Maybe it's an electronic Kanban board. Maybe you start to actually see more and more use of IRC. You start to see your experience expanding beyond the immediacy of the now and the here and the now. A single individual rarely resolves most modern technical problems. Teams provide great advantages because they have wider attention, they have broader expertise, they bring in alternative perspectives. I was working with my wife to replace a mirror on our RV. One of us, I won't say which one, had backed the RV out and knocked the mirror off. And we found a mirror, we sourced one, and we're replacing it. And at one point, we dropped a nut down in the door. Whoever's worked on a car door. Oh, I hear some groaning. There's at least 3 or 4 people here who've done that, right? And I got the magnet, and I got the dental mirror and the flashlight, and I'm looking in the bottom of the door, and I cannot find this stupid nut. And then my wife steps back, and she thinks outside the box, and she said, are we sure it's at the bottom of the door? And so she looked in at the hole up top, and there was this little ledge. And and the nut had landed on the ledge. Now, I could have spent another 3 hours messing around in the bottom of the door, but because we had a team of the two of us, we got through the problem, and that's why teams succeed. That's why teamwork is so important, and why diverse teams, the more diverse the better, because when people come from different frames of reference, they tend to be more data and fact driven. Cisco did some research on the importance of diversity within teams, and that was one of the things they discovered. But the coordination costs can outweigh all this. The team doesn't scale once you get it to the point where you've got hundreds of people calling into the change advisory or the incident advisory. So how do we start to solve that across the 3 dimensions? And that's where you get into the team of teams problem. This is where you need products like xMatters. This is where you start to need formal ticketing as a coordination mechanism. And this is where the industry discussions are really active, and I want to be hearing from all of you as to what's working in your organizations and what isn't as we move into this new era of Agile and DevOps. And ITIL and ITSM, yet still being a thing, ServiceNow heading towards being a billion-dollar company, and not really, from my perspective, having an overall industry framework that brings it together and makes sense of it. So I'm on a quest for that. Keep in touch, please. How are we doing on time? I'm getting close, but we're okay? Okay. So every team, team autonomy, great. Now I've got 300 teams that are all using different tools. How do I coordinate? Where's my common ground? Where's my interpredictability? Team autonomy is great, but at a team of teams level, sustaining common ground is not necessarily simple, and simplistic answers like self-organization and empowerment, I'm sorry, call me a skeptic. Important values, and yet we still are trying to achieve non-trivial outcomes where people's lives may be at stake. So we need to reduce the friction between the teams while maintaining self-organization. I think this is the central challenge of Agile. How do you maintain the value of team-level delivery and team-level coordination in that broader context when you need coordinated action across the teams? And I'm sorry, APIs and microservices are not the one-size-fits-all answer to all the problems. Swarming is really an interesting one. The other thing we start to see at this level is that the idea that all support is handled by the product team is just naive. You can't scale support that way. You need scalable support services. And so your help desk, your service management actually becomes itself a product. And I'm actually cluing you in on some research and some lines of thinking I'll be promoting in the industry, is that you actually, if you're going to develop a digital service and you know it's going to have hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of users, then the help desk becomes an essential component of that, just like your content delivery network, like your Akamai, was an essential physical component of your architecture. Your help desk becomes also an essential collaborative component, unless you think that everything can be handled through self-service. And that's actually the direction that Amazon and Google took, in their early years, which was why people said they're not ready for enterprise yet, because self-service will get you only so far. And then you need to start being able to muster and marshal people in. Now, swarming is a really interesting trend here. Who here has heard of swarming? Okay. There is a Consortium for Service Innovation, very good overview deck. Greg Oxton, I think, is the gentleman's name. I just met him on LinkedIn. It sounds so disorganized, but actually swarming in actual practice, it's a different form of triage and dispatch, and it's meant to reduce the problem of overloaded specialists you get in the traditional L1, L2, L3 structure. So I don't have time to go, swarming itself could be a whole conversation, but the essence of it is that there should not be tiered support groups. There should be no escalations from one grouper to the other beyond some just initial triage referral. The case should move directly to the person most likely to be able to resolve it, and that person who takes it will see it through to resolution. And there's also some objectives around empowering and training and educating and sharing knowledge amongst the lesser experienced specialist, rather than the strict career progression of L1 goes to L2. You bring them in more early because, again, it's that shared common ground, that inner predictability. That is an output of people actively collaborating and learning in a dynamic process of resolution. And when you say, well, your L1 people, all they get to do is just look up stuff in the knowledge base, you're diminishing their ability to learn and at the same time overloading your L2s and L3s. At least that's the hypothesis. I will not claim to be an expert on swarming. But I think it's a very interesting dynamic. And finally, at the enterprise level, well, what do we mean by the enterprise? I equate enterprise with the word governance. And this also plays out in incident management and so forth because, for example, when I was at Wells Fargo, every major incident, by definition, was significant and had to be reported to the OCC. The conference bridges had to be recorded. Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, who regulates the banks. And so these become a big deal. And that is a classic example of a governance or a regulatory compliance concern. And enterprise is, by my definition, it's not that you're not have regulatory compliance concerns at smaller levels of the organization, but at the enterprise level, they really, at the scale level, they become very defining. They define large portions of your behavior. They're not just this occasional annual, got to renew my corporate registration once a year kind of a hassle. You have regulators living on site all the time. And so major incident management, when lots at stake, certainly relates a lot at the enterprise level. You start to see formal forensics, formal audits. You start to see a great deal of attention, interest in postmortems. And the idea of having a full audit trail of what was the nature of the discussion, what was being discussed at the time that then the DBA took the response of reindexing the database that ultimately didn't lead to a good outcome. Well, we have an audit trail now, especially with modern tooling. It becomes so important, not from a blame, shame, name point of view, but because it enables the postmortem. And the postmortem becomes absolutely critical here. In fact, proactive problem resolution actually was starting to become a regulatory requirement conversation as I was starting to depart the bank. It was interesting that way. And so finally, as a bit of an interactive exercise, I want to, there's more I could say about automation and so forth, but I feel like this is a good point to start to wrap up here. I offer this matrix to you. This is just a first draft of what we may turn into some advisory artifact that I might start to use more in the field. But it's just a way, if you were to mentally go through in your head. Now what we have here is we have various mechanisms, various tools we use in different contexts. And they play out in different ways across space, time, bandwidth, and in terms of the scale. So for example, NOCs, network operating centers, war rooms, typically the assumption is that there's nearness of space. Now that's, of course, you can always stick a conference bridge in the war room, but strictly speaking, physical presence, war rooms. Now, your pros, your advantage is that it's synchronous. You've got high bandwidth, but it doesn't scale all that well. And you see where I'm going with this. And you could take your examples and think through, well, what is our current NOC and war room strategy? How often do we declare them? And have we found that they increase common ground and interpredictability? You can take all of the coordination criteria and start to reason through each one of the cells on the matrix in terms of, well, what does this do in terms of my ability to assume that somebody is going to behave a certain way given a certain signal? What does this do in terms of attending to the, certainly when somebody's in a war room and they're, got their device or they're reading a paper, hey, it's like, come on, pay attention. But when they're on the conference bridge, not so easy. That's why some companies go to video conferences, not because they're expecting to get any kind of emotional content. They just want to make sure that people are paying attention, and you can do that if you've got a bunch of faces there. Although I think you could probably just you could put a closed loop video recording of your face on that. Looking for the angle. I don't have this all filled out, but for example, calls and bridges. What's the time dimension there? Synchronous. Exactly. And yet space is far. You get the point. the bar is calling, so maybe I won't belabor this one. But maybe this would be maybe a good time for a little. I don't have a grand finale, and then like self-criticism. Well, okay, so I'm going to actually skip here. I do have my takeaways. So I'm going to keep working on the overall narrative arc of this presentation. I appreciate you attending so well and paying attention and I think comprehending. I saw a lot of comprehension here too. So without the grand culminating finale, let me just cut to some takeaways. So DevOps may improve your change capability, but the unexpected still happens. Think about how you define coordination in your organization. And if you have any debate or confusion about it, turn to that pyramid. Start to look at it. Bring in these other concepts. What is your basic compact, your common ground? Your channels, your choreography. Gives you like a sense of objectivity. It gives you some distance, some remoteness from the problem. That can be very helpful as you're trying to improve. And then finally, think about the different levels of scale. Even if you're in a very large organization, you still have coordination problems that play out at the team level. And then that team of teams boundary. Fascinating state transition. So much going on there, so much good discussion. And then at the enterprise level, of course. Ultimately, what trade-offs is your organization making in terms of that matrix? Where have you chosen to center your attention, your investment, your focus? Do you have this all covered and all well understood? Do you understand the pros and cons and trade-offs of each? And hopefully, by working through those things, you'll be able to incrementally move your organizations forward as we engage in digital transformation, delivering higher and higher value for social, economic benefit, reducing risk, giving us better outcomes in all aspects of life, health, wellness, prosperity, so forth. So with that, I thank you very much for your time, and I think the bar is...
Thanks so much, Charlie. Any questions for Charlie before we hand it off to Bus? Yep.
Yes.
Thanks. This is not really a very well-formed question. I'm not even sure if I have a question out of it. But I first came into swarming through robotics. And the idea there was it's emergent behaviors in a large group of individuals, like schools of fish or flocks of birds.
Yes.
So I'm curious how that relates to swarming and incident management.
Swarming and incident management is a little bit more well specified. It's not your classic emergent behavior that's based on cellular automata. If you just give these like 3 rules to the bird, fly in that direction, position yourself off the leader, and you get all these gorgeous murmurations is what they're called. The swarming here is not so much like that. It's more of a specific alternative mechanism to solving certain problems of queuing and knowledge creation in the context of responding to emergent problems and abnormalities. So it would be nice if there was more comparability, but I didn't. And I'm not, I don't claim to be an expert on swarming that way either. Good question.
Chatbots is trying to go in that direction, but
yes. Yes. Yes.
All right. Any other questions? Yeah.
I don't need the mic. I've been wanting to ask this to a lot of the other presenters as well, but I think it fits well into yours also. How does the notion of anti-fragile or anti-fragility fit into what you were just talking about?
Yeah, how does the notion of anti-fragile, anti-fragility fit in? There's been some great commentary on that when you have a fast feedback, fast learning mechanism, that is essentially anti-fragility, especially when you engage in activities that stress the system without breaking it irretrievably. And so certainly, people have pointed out, well, isn't this what DevOps is all about? Isn't this what the simian army is all about? Is, by constantly injecting failure, it's like vaccination. You constantly inject a little bit of failure so that people learn what the failure modes are in the context of the actual system rather than some simulation. And so, yes, I think it's very, very applicable.
But always trying to be in a safe setting, right?
Ideally, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's like SpaceX, for example. I mean, sure, yeah, they're sending those rockets up and they're crashing half of them, but they're learning a lot, and because the rockets are less expensive. But if one of those rockets were to crash into a populated area in Los Angeles, that'd be a very different conversation. Don't fail fast in my backyard, or something like that.
Any other questions for Charlie? All right, give Charlie a round of applause. That was a great presentation.